The autumn wind swept across the high plains that moonless night, carrying the scent of distant storms and the promise of violence yet to come. Elise Morrison ran barefoot through the buffalo grass, her black mourning dress catching on thorns with each desperate stride. The wicker basket pressed against her chest contained something more precious than all the gold in California. A newborn baby barely 3 days old, whose soft cries pierced the darkness like a beacon for the armed men who hunted them both with murderous intent. Behind her, hoofbeats thundered through the night, like the drums of war. Lanterns swayed wildly as two riders crashed through the brush, their horses snorting and blowing from the hard chase across miles of broken country. She went toward the creek. Greasy Pete's voice carried clearly across the prairie, harsh as grinding stone. Can't be far with that burden slowing her down. Lightning Bill wheeled his mount toward the water with practiced precision rope coiled in one weathered hand, shotgun balanced across his pommel with the ease of long familiarity. Both men wore the blue kerchiefs of Conrad Dietrich's outfit, and both carried themselves with the cold efficiency of professional killers who worked for wages rather than passion. Elise recognized their type instantly. She had seen such men before in the faces of those who came calling, when debts couldn't be paid. And mercy wasn't profitable in the harsh mathematics of frontier survival. Her bare feet found every sharp stone and grass spine in the darkness, leaving a trail of blood drops that would be easy to follow come dawn. Each step sent fire shooting up her legs, but she didn't dare slow her desperate flight. Dawn was still hours away, and she needed only to reach the flickering campfires ahead, the Comanche lodges that most whites avoided like plague ground. Tonight, that very fear might prove to be her salvation and the baby's only hope for survival. She had discovered the infant just 2 hours earlier, abandoned behind Murphy's livery stable like unwanted goods left for the garbage collector. The sight had torn something loose in her chest, awakening the same protective fury that had kept her going through the terrible months since Thomas died, cutting timber for the Copper Gulch mine. The memory of her husband's crushed body beneath those massive logs still visited her dreams, but this innocent child's plight cut even deeper than her own grief. This baby was helpless, completely dependent on her courage in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything pure and good. There by the fence line, Lightning Bill's shout cracked like a whip across the night air, sharp enough to scatter the nightbirds from their roosts. The rifle shot came immediately after the bullet whining past her ear, close enough to feel its deadly breath before it splintered wood from a corral post in a shower of white fragments. She threw herself sideways without thinking, rolling under the bottom rail of the horse enclosure, with the basket clutched protectively against her body. The horses inside snorted and danced nervously around her sudden appearance, their iron shoes drumming the packed earth as they caught the scent of fear and blood. The loose straw scattered around the feeding area scratched her face as she burrowed deep like a hunted animal, pulling dried grass over the basket, until only the baby's peaceful face remained visible in the starlight. His dark eyes opened briefly unfocused, but somehow trusting, reflecting the distant fires before closing again in the sleep of complete innocence. Even in this desperate moment, surrounded by danger and violence, he seemed to sense that someone was protecting him from the evil that stalked the night. "She's in there somewhere," Pete growled from beyond the fence, his voice thick with tobacco juice and frustrated anger. "Get the ropes ready. We'll drag her out if we have to burn down every building in this camp." "Wait just a minute." Lightning Bill's voice carried new uncertainty, the first crack in his aggressive confidence. "You see them fires, they're all watching us now. Every damn one of them has probably got a rifle pointed our way." Indeed, shadows were moving between the buffalo hide lodges with purposeful stealth. Dark figures emerged from dwellings like spirits, materializing from the earth itself, some carrying rifles with casual competence, others with bows strung and arrows nocked with deadly precision. The Comanche had awakened to find armed whites threatening their horse herd in the depths of night, and they took such provocations with the deadly seriousness of people who had learned that survival depended on meeting threats with overwhelming force. From the deepest shadow beside the corral gate, a man stepped into the faint starlight. With movements so fluid, they seemed to flow like water over stone. Tall and broad-shouldered, he possessed the natural grace of a born predator, whose every gesture spoke of lethal capability held in careful check. His buckskin shirt bore the wear and staining of countless seasons in the wilderness, and his black hair hung loose around features that might have been carved from the surrounding stone by some ancient sculptor. A bow rode his shoulder with its quiver of eagle-fletched arrows, and his dark eyes missed nothing, as they swept from the hidden woman to the armed intruders who had violated the sanctity of his people's camp. "You lost." His English carried only the faintest accent, each word precisely chosen and delivered, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Lightning Bill shifted nervously in his saddle, suddenly aware that rifle barrels tracked his every movement from the surrounding darkness. The confident aggression that had carried him through the night's hunt was rapidly evaporating in the face of superior numbers and tactical disadvantage. Looking for a thief breed. Woman stole something mighty valuable from town. Trail led this way clear as day. I see horse tracks, boot tracks. The warrior's gaze dropped to read the story written in churned earth as clearly as words printed on a page. His tracking skills could interpret every hoofprint, every disturbed stone, every blade of bent grass, with the precision of a scholar reading ancient manuscripts. No woman tracks here. Only horses and men with iron shoes. She's hiding in there somewhere, and you damn well know it. Pete spat with growing desperation, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. We got every legal right to search for stolen property, breed or no breed. The silence that followed stretched taut as a violin string vibrating at its breaking point. From the lodges came soft sounds that spoke of preparation for war. Children being hushed and moved to safety, women gathering weapons and ammunition. Warriors taking carefully planned positions that would turn the camp into a killing ground if violence erupted. The night air itself seemed to vibrate with potential bloodshed. The warrior Quanah, though Elise wouldn't learn his name until later, took a single step forward with deliberate slowness. The movement was unhurried, but somehow final, like the settling of a stone that would never be moved again. You search my camp. You bring woman, lawkeeper. You bring daylight, not guns in darkness. This is white man's law, yes. Or do you make your own laws when it suits your purposes? It was a masterful response that used their own legal customs as weapons against them. Even corrupt territorial officials needed female deputies to search women's quarters, and night raids with armed posses looked more like banditry than proper law enforcement. Lightning Bill cursed under his breath, calculating odds that were growing worse by the moment as more armed figures appeared in the firelight. This ain't finished by a long shot, Buck. He snarled, jerking his reins around with unnecessary violence. We know she's here, and we'll be back with proper authority to tear this place apart board by board if necessary. Come back with proper papers signed by territorial judge, Quanah replied with implacable calm. We talk then like civilized men who respect law instead of making it up as we go. The two riders spurred their mounts away into the darkness, their lantern light fading like dying stars until only the sound of hoofbeats remained, then nothing but the eternal wind in the tall grass. Quanah waited with infinite patience until even those distant sounds died completely before approaching the corral with steps so quiet they barely disturbed the dust beneath his moccasins. Woman, he whispered, his voice carrying barely above the night breeze. They have gone to lick their wounds and plan new troubles. You can come out now. Elise emerged from the haystack like a ghost, materializing from the spirit world straw, clinging to her black mourning dress and tangling in auburn hair that had escaped its careful pins during her desperate flight. Despite her 22 years' grief and the harsh realities of frontier life had aged her beyond her chronological time, carving lines around green eyes that still held the fierce determination of someone who refused to surrender to circumstances beyond her control. "Please," she whispered, holding the basket protectively against her chest as if it contained her own heart. "He's just a baby, innocent of everything except being born into a world that wants him dead." Quanah studied her for a long moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, taking in every detail: the torn and blood-stained mourning dress, the bleeding feet that spoke of desperate flight across unforgiving terrain, and the fierce, maternal protectiveness that radiated from her small frame, like heat from a forge fire. When he finally gestured toward his lodge, it was with the economical motion of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions with split-second timing and absolute confidence in his own judgment. His dwelling stood apart from the others, like a monument to solitary leadership, its buffalo hide walls painted with intricate scenes of horses and hunters that seemed to move and dance in the flickering firelight. The images told stories of great hunts and greater battles of a people's history written in pigments made from earth and blood and sacred clay. Inside, carved lodge poles supported the conical structure, their surfaces decorated with feathers from eagles and hawks' beads made from porcupine quills, and trade goods, small animal bones that caught the flames like scattered stars fallen to earth. "Sit." He indicated a pile of buffalo robes arranged near the central fire pit, where glowing coals provided warmth without excessive light that might betray their presence to watching enemies. "Show me what brings armed white men to disturb the peace of sleeping children." With hands that trembled from exhaustion, fear, and the adrenaline crash that followed desperate flight, Elise pulled back the woolen shawl that had served as the baby's only protection against the cold night air. The infant lay perfect in miniature, his tiny fists waving at shadows that danced on the painted lodge walls. Dark hair crowned his small head in soft curls, and his breathing came gentle and regular, despite the night's terrors. In sleep, his face showed the complete trust and innocence that only the very young possessed, unmarked by knowledge of the evil that men could do to each other for profit and power. Quanah knelt beside them with surprising gentleness. For such a large and obviously dangerous man, his calloused fingers as soft as feathers when he touched the child's forehead. The baby stirred at the contact, but didn't wake, somehow sensing safety in this stranger's presence, despite never having seen his face before. For a moment, something flickered across Quanah's weathered features, an expression too complex to read completely, but unmistakably touched with both ancient sorrow and sudden recognition, as if he saw something in this child that connected to deep currents in his own life and history. "Both of you stay," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow spoken before sacred fires. "Both of you stay here under my protection. I mean this with every breath in my body." Relief flooded through Elise with such overwhelming power that tears she had held back through hours of terror finally spilled down her cheeks in hot streams. In this place, where two worlds met and usually clashed in violence and misunderstanding, she had found what her desperate flight had sought: sanctuary offered by a man whose word was clearly as solid and unshakable as the mountains that ringed their hidden valley. But even as safety settled around her like the warmth of buffalo robes, she couldn't know that Quanah's promise had already been compromised by desperate circumstances beyond anyone's control. She couldn't know that the baby sleeping so peacefully in her arms carried secrets worth killing for, or that the very man who offered protection was being torn apart by an impossible choice between honor and survival that would soon test every principle he held sacred. Outside the lodge, autumn wind continued to whisper across the endless grassland. But now its voice carried more than just the promise of distant storms. It spoke of alliances that would cross the bitter boundaries of race and culture, of courage that would transcend mere self-interest, of the terrible price that honorable people sometimes paid when they chose to protect innocence in a world increasingly ruled by greed and systematic corruption. The fire crackled softly as Elise finally allowed herself to sleep, one hand resting protectively on the baby's chest, to feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. But her dreams were troubled by visions of pale eyes, watching from darkness, of men who would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, and of a reckoning that was coming with the inevitability of sunrise over the high plains where justice was whatever the strongest could impose on the weak. Dawn crept across the plains like a cautious animal, painting the eastern sky in delicate shades of rose and gold that promised another day of autumn heat before winter's final arrival. Elise woke to find herself covered with soft deer hide that smelled of sage and wood smoke. The baby nestled warm and secure against her side, where Quanah had carefully arranged them both during the dark hours. The central fire had been tended with such skill that it provided steady warmth without producing excessive smoke that might signal their location to enemies who would certainly return with greater numbers and legal authority. An older Comanche woman knelt beside the fire pit, her weathered hands preparing strips of clean cloth with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended countless wounds over decades of frontier hardship. Her graying hair was braided with strips of colored cloth and decorated with small silver ornaments that caught the firelight. And her deeply lined face showed the patient wisdom of someone who had birthed and raised many children through the harsh cycles of plains life. "For wounds on your feet," she explained in careful English that carried only traces of her native accent. Her voice was gentle but firm, brooking no argument about the necessity of proper medical care. "I am Wachiwi, mother to Quanah, grandmother to this camp. You are safe here, child, but that little one needs proper care soon, or he will sicken." As Wachiwi cleaned and bound her injuries with hands as gentle as any trained nurse, Elise found herself telling the whole story, how she had found the abandoned infant, how Thomas had died in the logging accident that left her alone, and grieving how armed men had pursued them through the night, with obvious intent to kill rather than capture. The older woman listened without judgment, her dark eyes growing troubled only when the narrative touched on the men who had shown such determination to silence a helpless child. "Dietrich's riders," Wachiwi said grimly. When the tale was finished, her voice carrying decades of bitter experience with white men who took what they wanted without regard for law or decency. Bad men who steal water rights, burn out small farmers, hurt anyone too weak to fight back. They serve evil master who thinks all land belongs to him by right of superior greed. Voices outside the lodge announced the arrival of visitors, their calls carrying the careful courtesy that marked allies rather than enemies. Through the entrance flap, Elise could see a small group approaching on horseback, a middle-aged man in the black coat of a professional, a woman in practical brown dress riding side saddle with obvious skill, and a weathered farmer on a plow horse that had clearly been pressed into emergency riding service. Dr. Edwin Hartwell dismounted first, his lined face showing the patient expression that came from years of dealing with frontier troubles and human suffering. But there was something else in his pale blue eyes, a flicker of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the medical emergency he had supposedly been summoned to address. His hands shook slightly as he checked his medical bag, and his gaze kept drifting toward the canyon mouth as if he expected unwelcome visitors to arrive at any moment. "Markinar. Morning, Quanah," he called with forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask underlying tension. Heard through the usual channels that there might be medical needs here requiring immediate attention. As Edwin examined the baby with professional thoroughness, Elise noticed disturbing details that made her maternal instincts prickle with unease. His hands trembled more than could be explained by morning cold. His breathing was shallow and rapid, as if he were suppressing panic. And when he pronounced the infant healthy but in need of better nutrition, his voice carried an odd strain that suggested words spoken against his will. The woman who introduced herself as Grace Hamilton seemed more straightforward, but even she carried subtle signs of hidden depths. Her school teacher's dress was practical and well-made, but beneath her coat was a small bulge that might have been a concealed weapon, unusual for an educator, but perhaps understandable in territory where violence could erupt without warning. "I knew this baby's mother," Grace said, producing a wool cloak from her saddlebags with hands that moved with more precision than a simple teacher might possess. "Violet was one of my students until her parents died of typhoid 2 years ago. Sweet girl, barely 17, vanished from town last spring after some trouble with men who wanted her family's land." The third visitor, Walter Kemp, brought news that transformed their understanding of the situation entirely. His weathered farmer's face was grim as he dismounted and tied his horse to the corral fence, with hands that showed the calluses of honest labor. "My wife Sarah helped with a birthing 3 nights ago," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone reporting facts too terrible for emotional elaboration. "Got an anonymous message written on expensive paper payment, left in gold coins, woman, in desperate need of midwife assistance. Sarah went because it's what any Christian woman does when called to help." He paused to gather himself before continuing with the worst part of his report. "Found poor Violet in a soddy about 10 miles east of here, barely more than a cave with plank walls and dirt floor. She'd been in labor alone for near 2 days, with no help, no clean water, not even proper food for a woman birthing a child. Sarah did everything humanly possible, but the girl was already dying from complications and neglect." The revelation hung heavy in the morning air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. This wasn't simply an abandoned child. He was the survivor of a deliberate murder left to die, alongside his mother, in circumstances that spoke of calculated cruelty rather than mere indifference. Or Violet lived just long enough to beg Sarah to hide her baby somewhere safe. Walter continued, his voice growing heavy with suppressed anger. "Said there were powerful men who would kill the child to steal his inheritance, men who had already murdered her by abandoning her to die alone when she refused to sign away her legal rights. It was then that Dr. Edwin made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. While examining the wicker basket more thoroughly for signs of infant illness, his trained fingers detected an irregularity in the weaving of false bottom that had been carefully constructed to conceal precious cargo. His hands shook visibly as he worked at the hidden compartment and extracting an oiled cloth packet that had been protected from moisture and casual discovery. Inside lay a folded document bearing official territorial seals, along with a county filing stub that bore a single name written in a woman's careful script: Violet. Land deed. Grace breathed, reading over his shoulder with growing amazement and understanding. For a homestead called Widow's Well, signed and witnessed according to territorial law, filed properly with the county clerk and bearing all the legal requirements for valid ownership. Her teacher's voice grew grim as the full implications became clear to everyone present. That spring feeds half the cattle herds in this territory during the dry summer months. If this baby is Violet's legitimate heir, he owns water rights worth more than most people see in several lifetimes. Could ruin Conrad Dietrich completely. Walter added with the farmer's understanding of how water law worked in arid country. Without access to Widow's Well during drought years, his cattle empire would collapse within a single bad season. But Elise was no longer listening to their economic calculations. She was watching Dr. Edwin's face as he studied the precious deed, seeing something there that chilled her blood to ice water in her veins. Relief. Not surprise at an unexpected discovery, but relief that a long-sought prize had finally been located. As if he had been searching for exactly this document, as if finding it solved rather than created dangerous problems. Before she could voice her growing suspicions about the doctor's true loyalties, the thunder of approaching horses shattered the morning peace like cannon fire. Sheriff Carl Anton appeared at the head of a much larger force than before, his steel-gray hair visible beneath the badge that gave him power of life and death throughout the territorial jurisdiction. Behind him rode not just his usual deputies, but a stern-faced woman whose badge marked her as official female law enforcement, along with 8 hard-faced men whose professional bearing suggested military or paramilitary experience rather than simple ranch work. By direct order of territorial government and federal mandate. Anton called out his voice, carrying the absolute authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged. I demand immediate entry to search these premises for stolen property and a wanted fugitive who has violated multiple territorial statutes. This time, he had come prepared for every legal objection that had frustrated his previous attempt. The warrant he produced with theatrical flourish looked authentic in every detail, complete with territorial seals and signatures that would be difficult to challenge without expert legal assistance. Quanah stepped forward with his Winchester rifle held ready, but not yet directly threatening his dark eyes, reading the tactical situation with the expertise of someone who had survived countless similar confrontations. Sheriff brings proper papers this time. Signed by Judge Caldwell himself with full territorial backing. Anton replied with obvious satisfaction. We're searching every lodge, every hiding place, every root cellar, until we find what was stolen from its rightful owners. The legal document appeared genuine enough to satisfy most observers. But Grace Hamilton stepped forward with her teacher's authority, lending unexpected weight to her challenge. Judge Caldwell has no legal jurisdiction in this territory, Sheriff. His court authority ends at Copper Creek, 20 miles south of here according to the territorial boundary established in 1867. Anton's pale eyes narrowed dangerously at this unexpected resistance from someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. Federal authority supersedes all local jurisdictional limitations in matters involving territorial security and interstate commerce. That document gives me every bit of power I need to conduct this search. As the standoff intensified with legal arguments and veiled threats, Elise noticed Dr. Edwin backing slowly toward his horse, with movements that suggested barely controlled panic rather than simple caution. His medical bag was clutched tightly against his chest, and when their eyes met for a brief moment, she saw naked terror in his expression, not fear of Anton's threats, but terror of something far more personal and immediately devastating. The baby needs feeding. Edwin announced suddenly, his voice too loud and too urgent for the medical situation he described. I have cow's milk mixed with molasses in my saddlebags, specially prepared to keep him healthy during whatever difficulties may arise here. But as he prepared the feeding bottle with shaking hands, Elise saw him add something from a small amber vial, just a few drops of dark liquid that smelled sweet and medicinal. When she started to protest this unauthorized medication, he caught her eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly, mouthing words she couldn't quite understand, but which seemed to carry desperate urgency. The baby drank the prepared milk eagerly, his tiny hands grasping the bottle with the instinctive hunger of healthy infancy. But within minutes, his bright eyes grew heavy with unnatural drowsiness, his small body relaxing into sleep that seemed deeper and more profound than normal infant rest. Edwin's hands shook visibly as he checked the child's pulse, and breathing his face a mask of internal anguish that spoke of moral conflicts tearing his soul apart. What did you give him? Elise demanded in a whisper that carried all her growing suspicions and fears. Just laudanum in small measure. Edwin replied, but his eyes begged for forgiveness and understanding. Enough to keep him quiet, and still nothing more. Please trust me for a little while longer. I'm trying to protect you all, but there are complications. Terrible complications you don't fully understand yet. Before she could demand detailed explanations, Anton's patience finally ran out completely. Enough delays and legal quibbling. Begin the systematic search immediately. Every lodge, every hiding place, every possible concealment. Find that woman and child, or we'll burn this entire camp to the ground in the process. The next 30 minutes passed in barely controlled chaos, as armed men spread through the peaceful Comanche settlement, overturning personal belongings and threatening anyone who dared protest their violation of basic human dignity. Children cried in terror while their mothers tried to shield them from rough hands and harsh voices, and the older men fingered their weapons with the restraint of people who understood that resistance would mean massacre. But the thorough search proved completely fruitless. The baby's drugged sleep meant no crying to betray their location, and Wachiwi had hidden them in a root cellar that even systematic investigation somehow missed. When Anton's increasingly frustrated forces finally departed, empty-handed, the camp was left to clean up scattered belongings and tend to frightened children who would remember this violation for the rest of their lives. Only when the last hoofbeat had faded into distance did Dr. Edwin feel safe enough to provide his devastating explanation. His confession came in broken whispers of shame and terror that revealed the true complexity of their situation. "My daughter Emma," he said simply, his voice cracking with emotion that had been suppressed too long. "Dietrich's men took her 3 weeks ago when I refused to cooperate with their schemes to locate and silence that baby. They're holding her at his ranch house, said, if I don't help them find and deal with this problem permanently, I'll never see her alive again." The truth hit Elise like ice water thrown in her face. Edwin's apparent betrayal wasn't motivated by greed or simple cowardice. It was the desperate act of a father whose 8-year-old daughter's life hung in the balance of decisions he couldn't control. The laudanum he had given the baby had probably saved all their lives by preventing discovery during the search, even as it tore his medical conscience apart. "Where exactly is she being held?" Wachiwi asked with the gentle firmness of someone who understood the agonies of parenthood. "Locked in the main house at Dietrich's ranch, 20 miles north through broken country." Edwin replied, his professional composure completely shattered. "Guarded constantly by armed men who've made it clear they'll kill her without hesitation if I don't deliver what they want. She's just a child innocent of everything except having a father who tried to do the right thing." Grace Hamilton had been listening with growing intensity to this exchange. Now she produced a small leather folder from inside her coat, revealing a federal marshal's badge that gleamed with official authority in the firelight. "Dr. Hartwell," she said with formal precision. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Grace Hamilton, working undercover for the past 6 months to investigate systematic corruption and territorial law violations. We know about Dietrich's methods, and we're going to get your daughter back safely. But first, we need to secure this baby's safety and gather the evidence necessary to destroy Dietrich's entire criminal organization." The revelation transformed their desperate situation entirely. Grace was not just a concerned schoolteacher. She represented federal law enforcement with real power to challenge Dietrich's local authority and corrupt territorial connections. "How long have you been building this investigation?" Quanah asked with the tactical interest of someone who understood the importance of intelligence gathering. 6 months of careful work." Grace replied, her professional mask dropping to reveal genuine anger beneath. "Ever since young women started disappearing from homesteads, that Dietrich wanted to acquire through legal or illegal means. Violet wasn't his first victim, just the first to leave behind evidence we could use to expose his systematic criminal activities. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose patient work was finally bearing fruit. We've been documenting everything: the fraudulent land transfers, the intimidation campaigns against smallholders, the corruption of local law enforcement. But we needed proof of his most serious crimes, evidence that would hold up in federal court. This baby represents that proof, living testimony to premeditated murder and systematic corruption. But even as hope flickered in the growing light of dawn, new dangers were already moving to crush their fragile alliance. Walter Kemp returned from checking on his family with news that shattered any illusions about their temporary safety. "They burned me out completely," he reported with the flat tone of someone whose world had just collapsed. "Everything gone: house, barn, livestock scattered or killed. My wife and children barely escaped with their lives, had to hide in the creek bottom, while Dietrich's men torched everything we spent 15 years building." The message was unmistakably clear: anyone who helped them would face similar total destruction. Dietrich was applying systematic pressure to isolate them from potential allies, while tightening an inexorable net around their remaining hiding places. "We have to move immediately," Quanah decided with the tactical realism of someone who understood how quickly situations could deteriorate beyond any hope of survival. "Cannot provide protection here. When they return with overwhelming force and legal authority, we cannot challenge." "But where can we possibly go?" Elise asked, holding the still drowsy baby closer as maternal instincts warred with practical necessities. "He'll have men watching every road, every trail that leads away from this territory. And the baby's still so young and vulnerable." It was Grace who provided their only remaining option. "There's an abandoned army fort in Devil's Canyon built during the recent conflicts, but evacuated when the garrison was transferred east. Still defensible if we can reach it, and I sent word to my federal contacts yesterday morning using the military telegraph line. They should be able to provide protection once we're established there. But the journey will be extremely dangerous, 20 miles through country that's probably crawling with bounty hunters attracted by the enormous rewards Dietrich has posted. The prospect of traveling such a distance with an infant who needed constant care under conditions that could prove fatal to someone so young and helpless was daunting beyond measure. But remaining in their current location meant certain death once Dietrich's forces returned with sufficient numbers to overwhelm any resistance the small Comanche band could offer. As they made desperate preparations for what might be their final journey, Elise couldn't shake the growing feeling that they were missing something crucial about their situation. Quanah's behavior had grown increasingly strange throughout the morning moments of intense focus, followed by periods of distraction, as if he was wrestling with internal conflicts that had nothing to do with their immediate tactical situation. That afternoon, while the others gathered supplies and planned their route through the dangerous territory ahead, she overheard a conversation that chilled her very soul. Hidden behind the lodge wall, she listened as Quanah spoke in low, urgent tones with someone whose voice she recognized with growing horror. "The arrangement must be honored," Quanah was saying to his unseen companion. "But I need more time to prepare them properly. The baby cannot travel safely in his current condition, and the woman is exhausted beyond her limits." "Time is the one thing we don't have," came the reply in Sheriff Anton's unmistakable voice, carried on the wind from somewhere just outside the camp perimeter. "Dietrich's patience has reached its absolute limit. Deliver them tomorrow night at the old creek crossing, or the consequences will fall on every member of your band." Elise pressed closer to the lodge wall, her heart pounding with such force she feared it might betray her presence. As the horrible truth became crystal clear, Quanah had not simply offered them sanctuary out of noble impulse. He had already made a deal to betray them to their enemies in exchange for something he valued more than their lives. Remember what's at stake here. Anton continued with cruel precision. Your people have until the first winter storm to relocate to the reservation lands the government has designated. Without Dietrich's protection and the supplies we've promised, how many of your children will survive the cold months ahead? How many will die of starvation and disease because their leader chose misplaced sentiment over practical survival? Now she understood the impossible position that was tearing Quanah apart. His band was starving, facing forced removal to barren reservation lands, where they would likely perish during the brutal winter months. Dietrich had offered food blankets and protection from government removal in exchange for cooperation, the survival of dozens of innocent Comanche families purchased with the life of one unknown white child. The woman and baby will be delivered as agreed, Quanah said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that was destroying his honor even as it might save his people. But they must not be harmed unnecessarily. They are innocents caught in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. Their fate is not your concern, Anton replied with bureaucratic coldness. Your only responsibility is delivery at the specified time and location. What happens after that serves the greater good of territorial development and progress. As the voices faded into distance, Elise felt the crushing weight of impossible moral complexity settle on her shoulders. She could expose Quanah's planned betrayal, but doing so might doom dozens of innocent Comanche children to death by starvation and exposure during the coming winter. Yet remaining silent meant walking willingly into a trap that would certainly result in the baby's murder, and probably her own death as well. The ethical mathematics were staggering in their brutal simplicity. One life against many competing claims of loyalty and survival. The terrible calculus of choosing which innocent people deserved protection when not all could be saved simultaneously. In this harsh land where survival often required impossible choices, even the concepts of right and wrong became blurred beyond easy recognition. Outside the lodge, autumn wind whispered across the grassland with renewed urgency, as if nature itself could sense the approaching storm of violence and betrayal that would test every relationship and principle they had built during their desperate flight toward an increasingly uncertain sanctuary. The knowledge she now carried felt like poison in her veins, but it also sparked the beginning of a plan desperate enough to match their circumstances, a gamble that might save everyone if she had the courage to risk everything on one final throw of the dice against overwhelming odds and entrenched corruption. As night fell over the Comanche camp, Elise made her decision. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of whether justice could triumph over greed, whether unlikely alliances could overcome systematic oppression, and whether one woman's determination could change the fate of everyone she had come to love. In this harsh and unforgiving land, where survival was never guaranteed, and honor was a luxury that few could afford to maintain. The baby stirred in his sleep, making soft sounds that seemed to echo with all the hopes and dreams of a better future. If only they could live long enough to see it dawn over the high plains where violence and mercy walked hand in hand across an endless landscape of possibility and peril. The night that followed passed in fitful sleep, broken by the baby's occasional needs and Elise's racing thoughts as she refined the desperate plan that represented their only hope for survival. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of promise and threat, she had made peace with the terrible risks involved and prepared herself for what might be the final gamble of her young life. The morning brought no relief from the crushing weight of their situation. If anything, the approaching daylight only emphasized how little time remained before Quanah would be forced to honor his agreement with Anton. An agreement that meant death for the baby, and probably for herself as well, purchased with the survival of an entire Comanche band facing starvation and government persecution. As she fed the baby, his morning bottle carefully checking that Dr. Edwin added no laudanum, this time Elise caught the doctor's eye and motioned him closer under the pretense of discussing the infant's health and nutritional needs. "I know about the arrangement," she whispered, watching his face pale with understanding and growing fear. "About your daughter Emma, about Quanah's impossible choice, about everything that's driving this tragedy forward. But I have a plan that might save everyone if you have the courage to trust me with your child's life." Edwin's hands shook as he checked the baby's temperature, his voice barely audible when he replied, "What kind of plan could possibly work against such overwhelming odds?" "We're going to give Anton and Dietrich exactly what they want," she said, her green eyes bright with desperate determination. "But not in the way they expect, and not with the results they're counting on. Are you willing to risk everything on one final gamble?" Before Edwin could respond with anything beyond confused hope, Grace Hamilton approached with her federal marshal's badge now displayed openly on her coat. "We have multiple problems converging simultaneously," she announced with the professional calm that came from years of law enforcement experience. "The telegraph message I sent yesterday has been answered. Federal troops are mobilizing from Fort Gibson, but they're still 18 hours away at minimum. Meanwhile, Dietrich's forces are preparing for what appears to be a final assault designed to eliminate all witnesses and evidence." Walter Kemp arrived moments later with equally disturbing intelligence gathered from his network of desperate smallholders. "Talk to those farmers who haven't been burned out yet," he reported grimly. "They're willing to help if they can, but they're terrified of losing what little they have left. Dietrich's made it crystal clear that anyone who stands against his interests will be destroyed completely, family, property, future prospects, everything." The tactical situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision toward inevitable catastrophe. They were outnumbered by professional killers, outgunned by superior weaponry, and isolated from potential allies by systematic terror campaigns designed to prevent any organized resistance to Dietrich's criminal enterprise. It was then that Quanah made his appearance, his weathered face showing the unmistakable strain of a man who had spent the dark hours wrestling with his conscience and losing the battle against practical necessity. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decisions that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. "We leave for Devil's Canyon within the hour," he announced with forced resolution. "Cannot wait longer for federal assistance that may never arrive, cannot risk the lives of everyone in this camp for the sake of prolonging the inevitable." But Elise could see the truth burning in his dark eyes. This wasn't a journey toward the abandoned Army Fort Grace had described, but the first step in leading them to the creek crossing where Anton waited with superior firepower and legal authority that federal law would be forced to respect. Quanah's honor was being systematically destroyed by circumstances that offered no honorable alternatives. As the small party prepared for what everyone except Grace and Walter understood would be their final journey, Elise put her desperate plan into motion with the precision of someone who had only one chance to save multiple lives simultaneously. Drawing Grace aside under the pretense of discussing route planning and tactical considerations, she revealed everything she had overheard about Quanah's forced agreement and her own strategy for transforming the betrayal into an opportunity that might destroy their enemies instead of delivering victory into their hands. "You want me to coordinate what exactly?" Grace asked, her federal training clearly struggling with the audacious complexity of what Elise was proposing. "Trust me," Elise replied with quiet intensity. "Sometimes the most effective way to spring a trap is to walk into it deliberately, but with preparations the enemy doesn't expect and can't counter once events begin moving. Earlier this morning, I noticed your signal mirror in your saddlebag. Can you use it to communicate with anyone who might be watching for such signals?" Grace's eyes widened with understanding. There's a cavalry patrol that should be within 10 miles of here by now, following the route I specified in yesterday's telegraph message. If I can get to high ground with clear line of sight. The journey toward the creek crossing began in tense silence, with each member of their small group carrying private knowledge and hidden agendas that would soon collide with devastating force. Dr. Edwin rode with the haunted expression of a father whose daughter's life depended on decisions he couldn't control, his medical bag containing both healing supplies and the means to implement Elise's desperate gambit. Grace maintained her cover as a concerned schoolteacher, while secretly watching for opportunities to signal federal cavalry forces with her mirror. Walter Kemp brought up the rear with his farmer's rifle ready, and his weathered face set with the grim determination of a man who had lost everything and chosen to make that loss count for something meaningful. Quanah led them through increasingly broken country, along game trails that wound between rocky outcrops and brush-filled canyons. To casual observation, their route appeared to be heading toward the abandoned military fort as promised. But Elise noticed how their path consistently curved toward the south, toward the remote creek crossing, where Anton would be waiting with the firepower and legal authority necessary to end their resistance permanently. The baby remained peacefully quiet throughout the morning hours, alert enough to take nourishment, but calm enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention with crying that might betray their location to enemies who were certainly tracking their progress. His dark eyes seemed to follow movement with increasing awareness, as if some primitive part of his infant mind understood that adult conflicts were swirling around him with potentially fatal consequences. It was shortly after noon when they encountered the first unmistakable evidence that their enemies were tightening the net with professional precision. Fresh horse tracks crossed their trail in multiple locations, too many riders moving with too much coordination to be anything except a carefully planned operation designed to herd them toward a predetermined killing ground. How many different groups? Grace asked, her hand moving instinctively toward the concealed federal marshal's badge beneath her schoolteacher's coat. At least 3 separate forces. Quanah replied with tactical honesty that cost him visible effort. Maybe 15 or 20 riders total, moving to cut off escape routes while maintaining pressure toward specific destination. Walter spat accurately into the dust with farmer's disgust. Toward that creek crossing you've been angling us toward all morning. The place where Sheriff Anton's waiting with enough firepower to finish what he started back at your camp. The direct accusation hung in the air between them like the smoke from a discharged weapon. For a moment, Quanah's carefully maintained mask of stoic leadership cracked completely, revealing the tortured human being beneath someone being systematically destroyed by the impossible choice between personal honor and collective survival. 12 children in my band died this past summer, he said with voice that carried depths of pain that transcended individual concerns. Died from hunger, from diseases that proper food and medicine could have prevented, from the slow starvation that comes when traditional hunting grounds are closed and government rations never arrive as promised. His dark eyes burned with the fury of helpless responsibility. 20 more will die when winter storms come, if we don't have blanket-stored food permission to hunt in territories that Dietrich controls through corruption and violence. Tell me, white woman, is one unknown child's life worth more than 30 of my people's children? The moral complexity of his position was staggering in its brutal mathematics. Elise found herself understanding Quanah's anguish, even as she prepared to resist the betrayal it was forcing him to commit against every principle of honor and protection that had originally motivated his offer of sanctuary. There's still another way, she said quietly, adjusting the baby's position as he began to show signs of restlessness. A way that might save everyone if we're all willing to take risks we'd rather avoid. She outlined her plan in urgent whispers as they continued riding toward what everyone now understood would be the site of final confrontation. By the time she finished explaining her desperate strategy, even Grace was studying her with something approaching professional admiration for the sheer audacity of what she was proposing to attempt. "That's either absolutely brilliant or completely suicidal," the federal marshal observed with careful professional assessment. "Probably both simultaneously," Elise admitted with brutal honesty. "But it's the only option I can see that offers even a chance of everyone surviving with their principles and their lives intact." Dr. Edwin had been listening with growing hope and terror warring visibly in his expression. "What about Emma? If this gamble fails catastrophically?" "If we don't try something this desperate, we're all dead anyway," Walter pointed out with the practical wisdom that came from a lifetime of farming in country where survival was never guaranteed. "At least this way we go down fighting instead of just getting executed like livestock in a slaughter pen." The abandoned creek crossing lay nestled in a natural amphitheater, surrounded by low hills that provided perfect concealment for riflemen positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Sheriff Anton had chosen his killing ground with professional expertise, a place where superior numbers and firepower could be brought to bear against anyone foolish enough to enter the obvious trap that geography had prepared. As they approached the rendezvous point that would determine everyone's fate, Elise made her final preparations with the calm precision of someone who had made peace with terrible risks. The baby's afternoon feeding received another carefully measured dose of Dr. Edwin's laudanum, just enough to ensure peaceful sleep during the violence that was about to erupt, but not enough to endanger his health or survival. Grace performed final checks on the concealed weapons and federal documentation that would transform her from schoolteacher to law enforcement officer at the crucial moment. Walter positioned his farmer's rifle for immediate access, while maintaining the appearance of casual travel through peaceful country. Only Quanah remained unaware of the elaborate deception being prepared around him like a web designed to catch predators rather than prey. His visible anguish was completely genuine as he led them toward what he believed would result in their destruction, his warrior's honor being systematically destroyed by circumstances that offered no honorable alternatives for someone responsible for his people's survival. Sheriff Anton emerged from concealment behind screening brush as their small party entered the natural killing ground, flanked by more than a dozen heavily armed men whose professional bearing left no doubt about their intentions or capabilities. His pale eyes glittered with satisfaction as he witnessed his carefully orchestrated trap finally closing around the quarry he had pursued with such relentless determination. "Quanah," he called out with mock cordiality that fooled no one present. "Punctual as always, just as our agreement specified. I trust the terms of our arrangement are still acceptable to all parties involved." The Comanche leader's weathered face might have been carved from granite as he nodded with visible effort. "The woman and child are here as promised. The supplies for my people's winter survival will be delivered in full the moment our business reaches its proper conclusion." Anton replied, his smile holding all the warmth of Arctic wind. "Now, if you'll simply hand over the fugitives and the stolen documents, we can all return to our legitimate concerns." It was at this crucial moment that Elise played the opening card in her desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. Rising in her saddle with the baby held protectively against her chest, she called out in a voice that carried clearly across the natural amphitheater and echoed off the surrounding hills. "Sheriff Carl Anton, I believe you're looking for much more than just a kidnapped child and some property documents. You're looking for your own son." The words struck Anton like physical blows, visibly staggering him and causing several of his hired gunmen to exchange startled glances that revealed how completely this information had been concealed from his own allies. In the sudden silence that followed her devastating revelation, Elise continued with the ruthless precision of someone whose survival depended on perfect timing. "Violet Parsons told Sarah Kemp everything before she died, giving birth to your child," she announced, holding up a folded document that bore official seals and legal signatures. "How you promised to protect her family's land rights, how you seduced her with false promises of marriage and security, how you tried to force her to sign away her inheritance when she refused your continued demands for intimate favors." She paused to let the implications sink in before delivering the final blow. She also left a complete written confession, properly witnessed and notarized, according to territorial law, naming you specifically as the father of her child and describing in detail your attempts to coerce her into surrendering legal rights worth thousands of dollars. Anton's hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, but Grace Hamilton was already in motion with the fluid precision of federal law enforcement training. Her school teacher's facade dropped away, like a discarded mask, as she produced both her U.S. Marshal's badge and a Colt revolver that had been expertly concealed beneath her practical brown dress. "Sheriff Carl Anton," she announced in a voice that carried absolute federal authority. "You are under arrest for murder conspiracy, kidnapping, corruption of territorial office, and violation of federal statutes governing interstate commerce. Surrender your weapons immediately and submit to federal custody." The standoff that followed stretched taut as piano wire with armed men on both sides, calculating odds and consequences, while the baby slept peacefully in Elise's protective embrace. It was Anton who broke the deadly tension with laughter that held more rage than humor, more desperation than confidence. One federal marshal against 15 professional gunmen. He snarled his pale eyes, scanning the surrounding terrain for tactical advantages. "Your mathematics need considerable improvement, Marshal Hamilton." But Elise was far from finished with her carefully orchestrated revelations. "Actually, Sheriff, I believe you'll discover that the mathematical situation has changed quite dramatically in the past few hours." She raised her voice to carry to the hills that surrounded their exposed position. "Walter, perhaps it's time for our additional guests to make their presence known." The sound that answered her call was the thunder of many horses approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. Walter Kemp had indeed succeeded in rallying the smallholders whose homesteads had been threatened or destroyed by Dietrich's systematic expansion, not just a handful of desperate farmers, but nearly 40 men whose families had been driven from lands they had worked for generations. They appeared on the surrounding ridges, with rifles ready, and faces showing the grim determination of people who had finally chosen to fight back against organized oppression, rather than submit to gradual destruction. At almost the same moment, Grace's mirror caught the afternoon sun and flashed 3 times toward the eastern hills, a prearranged signal that brought immediate response. The bright notes of a cavalry bugle echoed across the canyon, followed by the drumming of military horses at full gallop. "Their federal cavalry approaching from Fort Gibson," Grace announced with professional satisfaction, consulting a pocket watch with obvious confidence in her timing. "Should arrive within minutes to handle prisoner transport and evidence collection." Anton's tactical situation had deteriorated from confident superiority to desperate disadvantage in a matter of moments. His hired professionals were not only outnumbered, but completely surrounded, facing men who were fighting for their families' futures rather than simple monetary wages, and backed by legitimate federal military authority. But the corrupt sheriff had not survived years of territorial politics without learning how to exploit every possible advantage when circumstances turned against him. Drawing himself up with the full authority of his badge and position, he made one final attempt to control the deteriorating situation through legal intimidation and bureaucratic threats. "You are all making a catastrophic error in judgment," he declared, his voice carrying across the natural amphitheater with practiced authority. "I am a duly appointed representative of legitimate territorial government, and any attack on my person constitutes armed rebellion against lawfully constituted authority. Federal troops will hunt down and execute every man who participates in this treasonous conspiracy. It was Dr. Edwin Hartwell who provided the response that shattered Anton's last hope of maintaining legal protection for his criminal activities. Reaching into his medical bag with hands that no longer shook with fear, he produced a leather-bound ledger that he held up for everyone present to see clearly. Complete medical records. Sheriff Anton. Edwin announced his voice, carrying a strength and authority that had been absent for weeks of coerced cooperation. Including detailed documentation of every payment you made for off-the-books medical services during the past 3 years. Payments made in gold coin rather than legal territorial currency payments that were never reported to tax authorities as required by law. He opened the ledger to a specific page, reading in a voice that carried clearly across the tense gathering of armed men. Violet Parsons, age 17, of Widow's Well Homestead. Private obstetrical services, complicated delivery requiring emergency intervention. Total fee of $50 gold paid in advance by Carl Anton, Territorial Sheriff. Patient deceased due to complications following childbirth. Male infant survived delivery. The documentary evidence was devastating in its clinical precision, corroborating every detail of Elise's accusations about Anton's relationship with Violet and his direct responsibility for her death through deliberate abandonment. Combined with the written confession that Violet had managed to leave behind, it painted an undeniable picture of seduction, coercion, and premeditated murder that even the most corrupt territorial courts would be forced to acknowledge. And where Sheriff Anton is my daughter Emma, Edwin continued his professional voice, now carrying the moral authority of a father whose child had been used as a weapon against him. Where is Emma Hartwell, age 8, kidnapped 3 weeks ago to ensure my cooperation with your criminal conspiracy? Anton's weathered face had gone the color of old parchment, but his gun hand remained steady despite the overwhelming evidence mounting against him. You want to see the child again breathing? He snarled with the desperation of a cornered animal. Then hand over that baby and all the legal documents, walk away from this confrontation, and pray I'm feeling merciful enough to let you live. The threat hung in the air, like the acrid smoke from discharged gunpowder. Everyone present understood that they had moved far beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Now it was simply a question of who would survive the violence that was about to explode across the Quiet Creek crossing with devastating finality. It was Quanah who broke the deadly stalemate, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had been building throughout the long, agonizing hours of moral conflict. Anton, he called out, his rifle now pointed directly at the corrupt sheriff's chest with unwavering precision. The arrangement between us is finished forever. I choose honor over expedience, choose protection of innocence over political survival for my people. Your entire band will starve to death this winter. Anton replied with vicious satisfaction, understanding exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. Every child in your camp will die of hunger and cold because of your misplaced sentimentality and romantic notions about warrior honor. Then we die with our principles intact. Quanah responded with simple dignity that transformed him from conflicted leader back into the honorable warrior he had always been at heart. Better to face death with honor than live with the shame of murdering innocent children for white man's political convenience. The shooting erupted an instant later, like a thunderclap of violence beginning from multiple directions as Anton's hired gunmen opened fire on the surrounding farmers, while the sheriff himself drew his revolver with deadly intent focused on Quanah. The natural amphitheater became a cauldron of gunfire and shouting voices as bullets whined off rocks and men sought whatever cover the terrain could provide against the crossfire that swept the enclosed space. Elise threw herself from her saddle with the baby clutched protectively against her body, rolling behind a fallen log as rifle fire swept across the area where she had been sitting just moments before. The infant woke at the thunderous sound of multiple weapons discharging simultaneously and began crying with lusty protest. But his voice was completely lost in the chaos of battle that raged around their precarious shelter. Walter Kemp's rallied farmers demonstrated that they understood far more than agricultural techniques, their hunting rifles speaking with deadly accuracy, as they systematically eliminated Anton's hired professionals from concealed positions on the hillsides. These were men who had fed their families by shooting game for years, and their marksmanship was evident in the rapid reduction of their enemies' effective numbers. Grace Hamilton moved with the fluid competence of professional federal law enforcement, her Colt revolver barking methodically as she advanced on Anton's position through cover provided by scattered boulders and natural depressions. Her badge might have been concealed for months of undercover work, but her tactical training had never been in question among those who knew her true identity. The battle's outcome was effectively decided by the arrival of genuine federal cavalry, just as Anton's surviving gunmen were beginning to break under the overwhelming pressure of superior numbers and tactical position. Marshal James Hayes led 20 blue uniformed troopers into the amphitheater at full gallop, their sabers gleaming and their carbines ready to end any remaining resistance to legitimate federal authority. The sound of military bugles echoing off the canyon walls was like the voice of justice itself, announcing that lawful government had finally arrived to restore order and punish criminal conspiracy. The gunfire ceased as abruptly as it had begun, with Anton's remaining hired killers throwing down their weapons in surrender rather than face the combined firepower of federal troops and armed civilians. Anton himself stood clutching a wounded shoulder, while Grace Hamilton's handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists with the finality of justice finally served. Sheriff Carl Anton. Marshal Hayes announced with formal precision, "You are under federal arrest for murder conspiracy, kidnapping, corruption of territorial office, and violation of multiple federal statutes. You will be transported immediately to the territorial capital for trial under federal jurisdiction." But Elise's attention was focused entirely on Dr. Edwin, who had approached Anton's captured horse and was examining the saddlebags with growing excitement and relief. "She's here," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion that had been suppressed for weeks of agonized cooperation. "Emma's alive and unharmed." The 8-year-old girl who emerged from her hiding place among the saddlebags was thin and obviously frightened, but she showed no signs of physical abuse or serious harm. Her reunion with her father provided the first moment of pure, unqualified joy that any of them had experienced during days of terror and violence. Edwin's tears of relief spoke eloquently of the anguish he had endured, forced to choose between his daughter's life and his sworn duty to protect all children who needed medical care. As federal troops efficiently secured the prisoners and provided medical attention to the wounded from both sides of the brief but intense battle, Judge Morrison arrived with a cavalry escort and the legal documentation necessary to settle Samuel's inheritance according to territorial and federal law. The elderly jurist's black robes lent appropriate gravity to his official pronouncement that Samuel Morrison, for Elise had legally adopted him during the proceedings, was the legitimate heir to Widow's Well and all the valuable water rights associated with the historic homestead. "This child will require proper guardianship as he grows to maturity," Judge Morrison observed, looking meaningfully at Elise with obvious approval for the courage she had demonstrated. "Someone who understands the tremendous responsibility that accompanies such wealth, someone who has already proven their willingness to protect his interests against overwhelming odds and systematic corruption." Elise looked down at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her arms, no longer seeing just an abandoned infant, but envisioning an entire future, a chance to build something genuinely good and lasting from the tragedy and violence that had brought them together. "I'll need considerable help and advice," she admitted honestly. Guidance from people who understand water law and land management people who won't try to cheat a child out of his rightful inheritance. You'll have all the assistance you need. Walter Kemp promised, speaking for the farmers and smallholders who had risked everything to stand with her when the final confrontation arrived. We understand what it means to fight for water rights in this harsh country. We'll make certain the boy receives fair and honest dealing from everyone who benefits from his inheritance. Quanah approached with his rifle slung and his weathered face showing relief that went far deeper than simple physical survival. My people offer protection as well, he said with formal dignity. We understand the nature of honor debts. You showed trust when trust was dangerous, demonstrated mercy when mercy could have cost your life. Your band needs supplies and security for the coming winter. Elise observed with practical wisdom. Perhaps we can arrange something that benefits everyone involved, grazing rights and water access, in exchange for protection, fair dealing, instead of the exploitation that Dietrich offered. It was the beginning of something unprecedented in the territory's violent history. A genuine partnership between white settlers, Comanche families, and federal law enforcement that was based on mutual respect rather than systematic exploitation. The baby sleeping peacefully in Elise's arms would grow up in a world where such cooperation was not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved, where his inheritance could benefit entire communities, rather than enriching only the corrupt and powerful. As the sun set over the creek crossing that had witnessed so much violence and betrayal, federal cavalry prepared to escort their prisoners toward territorial justice, while the unlikely alliance of farmers' lawmen and Comanche warriors began planning for a future that none of them could have imagined when the crisis first began. Dr. Edwin rode beside his rescued daughter, his medical bag once again, serving healing rather than coercion, his professional oath restored to its proper place in his hierarchy of values. Grace Hamilton had permanently shed her schoolteacher disguise for the federal marshal's uniform she had earned through months of dangerous undercover investigation. Walter Kemp was already calculating how water-sharing agreements and cooperative land management might benefit smallholders throughout the entire territorial district. And Elise Morrison found herself transformed from a grieving widow running desperately for her life into the guardian of vast wealth and even greater responsibility. The baby in her arms, Samuel Morrison, as all the legal documents would officially record, would never remember the violence that had surrounded his first days of existence. But he would live with its consequences and the extraordinary opportunities it had created for generations yet unborn. As they rode toward Willow Springs and the beginning of their new life together, autumn wind whispered across the endless grassland with promises of winter storms and spring renewals that would test and strengthen the alliances they had forged in blood and sacrifice. The frontier remained harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving to those who lacked the strength or wisdom to survive its relentless challenges. But it was also a place where courage and principle could triumph over systematic corruption, where unlikely partnerships could bridge the deepest cultural divisions, where one small life saved through the determination of strangers could change the future for countless others who would benefit from justice finally permanently established. The baby's gentle breathing was the only sound as darkness settled over the high plains. But in that peaceful rhythm lay all the hope and promise that the American frontier could offer to those brave enough to fight for righteousness in a land where justice had to be won, rather than simply expected. Behind them, the creek crossing returned to its natural silence, marked only by scattered brass cartridges and the permanent memory of a battle that had changed everything for everyone involved. Ahead lay Willow Springs, where federal authorities waited with legal documents that would secure Samuel's inheritance and ensure that Violet's ultimate sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose. The story was ending where it had begun, with a woman protecting a child against overwhelming odds and systematic corruption. But now Elise was no longer alone in her desperate mission, no longer fleeing from enemies too powerful and well-connected to defeat through individual resistance. She had allies who shared her absolute commitment to protecting innocents' resources sufficient to meet any challenge that might arise, and the unshakable certainty that Samuel Morrison would grow up in a world where justice was not only possible, but actively enforced by those with the power and determination to make it reality. The wind carried their voices into the vast darkness of the frontier night, speaking of hope triumphant over despair, of courage rewarded, and corruption punished with appropriate severity of one small life that had changed everything simply by surviving long enough for decent people to recognize its worth and fight effectively for its protection against those who would destroy it for profit. In the growing distance, the lights of Willow Springs beckoned like earthbound stars, promising sanctuary. Not just for this single night, but for all the nights and days to come. In a land where the innocent could finally sleep safely, while justice kept eternal vigilant watch over their dreams and their bright possibilities for the future.